This has been a disaster of a pandemic physically. It has been a disaster of a pandemic culturally. It has eroded whatever trust has been left.
John, there's one other thing I wanted to talk with you about. We've touched on this topic a little bit already, but this has especially come to the forefront this week as the news media has been talking a lot more about the situation with looking into the origins of the coronavirus. So there was a theory floated last spring, shortly after the pandemic really was underway, that this had potentially that the virus escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. And there was some pretty strong evidence pointing toward that as a possibility, not least of which that the wet market where this supposedly the first case was traced back to is mere kilometers away from a lab that was working on gain of function studies on the coronavirus. So gain of function is when these biologists are looking at viruses, usually in an attempt to figure out how to stop them or to cure them, but they're looking at whether they can manipulate a virus genetically or otherwise to make it especially potent or deadly or transmissible. It's basically in a field called synthetic biology or synbio, where people are just scientists are messing with viruses to see what they can become and then what we would do in response. So there's a lab where this sort of thing was happening with the coronavirus in Wuhan, and kilometers away from that is where the first case was reported. And then that theory was treated at the time last spring, I think primarily because President Trump was the one who sort of said with certainty, we know that this is how this happened. It was treated as totally debunked to the point where news outlets and journalists who were suggesting it on Twitter were actually shadow banned from Twitter. Twitter would shut down their accounts or remove their tweets and say, this is misinformation, be careful, etc. Well, now, especially because a new report came out this week, I think it was first published in the Wall Street Journal, that 2 of the scientists at this lab in Wuhan were hospitalized with COVID-like symptoms in November of 2019, which again is circumstantial, but seems to point to a real possibility that something bad happened in that lab. So now all these news outlets are saying, well, we need to look into this. And President Biden is saying we need to look into this and all that kind of stuff. And I'm bringing this up because this is part of a larger discussion we've been having about the loss of trust in institutions like the media or even the government. And this is certainly a bad case in point for why that could be happening. And I think we're seeing some of the fallout of that, just the uncertainty people feel about any information then coming from the media and the government. And in some cases, it's for good reason.
It is for good reason, but this is a larger cultural backdrop. So, one question I always like to ask is, if this story happened in a different time in a different place, would it still have had the same, would there still have been the same reaction or the same reality? And almost always, the answer to that is no. Unless you're talking about, some sort of, extinction level cataclysmic, meteor hitting, the earth sort of event. That's culturally neutral. But almost every other story becomes way more important or way less important because of the cultural moment that we're in. So one of the undercurrent trends that I talk about in Practical Guide to Culture and have talked about in teaching Worldview for a really long time is this idea that we live in what's called the information age. This is an enormous shift. Thomas Friedman talks about it in his new book, Thanks for Being Late. He's, how different it is. In other words, when we look back at history and we learn about this shift that took place in the Industrial Revolution, when the world went from being largely agrarian to largely industrial, we read about it as if it were an economic reality or something that changed the factories or the production cycle. In reality, it flipped the world upside down, top to bottom. It changed family structure. And roles. It changed where church fits in society and the scope and scale of government. It changed the relationship between local and federal government. It changed economic realities. I mean, you just name it. It was a cataclysmic cultural event. Well, we're in the middle of another one right now, right, which is the shift from the industrial to the information-based world, where things move in the Industrial Revolution from farms to factories. Basically, life has moved from factories to online, and that is a dramatic thing. We just got finished talking about the interpersonal angst that is created from it. Let's just go bigger. Now, one of the great questions in a culture like ours, in an age of information, is that things that we used to not have access to, we now have access to. I used to go and speak, for example, to Christian high schoolers in chapel, and I would introduce them to skeptical arguments because I didn't want the first time they heard these skeptical arguments to be when they were a freshman at college and their pastor and youth pastor and mom and dad and good friends were nowhere to be found because they were on their own. Now, I'm not introducing anybody if I do the exact same thing because those arguments, those other ideas are now front and center. So the age of information makes all of these ideas far more accessible. In fact, it makes some of these ideas even predatory. They're not only available to us, they actually come after us. This is the difference. Pornography before the information age, you've got to go find it. Pornography after the information age, it comes and finds you. So there's so many ways to talk about how things have changed. Also, the access to information gives one the illusion that they've really studied something, that they really know something. Even worse, that they've actually really done something. So all of this, Maria, is the reality of the information age. Now, there are certain existential questions that rise to the front in certain cultural moments. So when the Lisbon earthquake takes place in 72, let's just say, that gave Voltaire the context to highlight this question: where is God when bad things happen? Right? Why does God let bad things happen to good people? In our information age, the question that rises to the top already is, who do I trust?
Yeah.
Right? Because now all of this information gives us all of these ideas, which means all of these ideas give us all of these authorities. And the people that used to be authorities aren't authorities anymore. And we lose the discernment to tell the difference between someone who knows something and someone who doesn't. Now, all of this brings up tons of implications for Christians. One is, this has been a disaster of a pandemic physically. It has been a disaster of a pandemic culturally. It has eroded whatever trust has been left. The people who definitively told us things as if they were true without knowing, and then turning around and changing face. The people who said, in this particular case, that this is not a lab, that's a debunked theory, and now that's the dominant theory. That's not only a possibility, it is the most likely scenario that COVID originated in the lab. That's not the same thing as saying it was intentional. But my point is, we're driving information into people's heads, not by argument, but by force. Yeah. We're not reasoning it. We're not making compelling points and cases for the things we want to say. Yeah. That's why people don't have any trust anymore. Yeah. And conservatives or Christians far too often do the exact same thing. We try to advance our side by pointing to say that the other side said something different. So we end up lumping all of these issues together that don't fit. We end up dismissing people on the mere condition that they're on the other side of a political thing, rather than taking issue by issue, item by item, and looking at it carefully. And we use force, either the force of distraction, the force of entertainment, the force of power, the force of politics, to make our point, rather than treating people like the image of God that they are, honoring their minds as God-given gifts, and helping them come to conclusions that they need to come to. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Totally.
this is a bigger problem than just this story about the Wuhan lab, as big as that is. The Wuhan lab is just the biggest story we have had in the last year, which is saying something, by the way, in terms of, can we trust what we're being told? And the answer, of course, for many Americans is definitively, heck no. Right. Because people keep telling us things and that aren't true, and removing all competition. And that's not a way to go forward as a society. And it's also not honoring to an image of God.
And it would be one thing if, people who had, let's say with this specific example, but this happens all the time, who had come out, a year ago and said, this is debunked, this is fear mongering, don't listen to it. And then now we're saying, well, this is a legitimate theory. It would be one thing if those folks were willing to say, we were wrong last time. We're reevaluating. We can't believe how wrong we are. But, to almost to a news outlet right now, you're getting the responses, well, we gave you the best information we had at the time, and here's why we made that decision at the time. Where at the time, they certainly didn't present it as if it were the best information they had at the time. They presented it as if it were true.
Right.
But the world that they're operating in, that you talked about, the internet and the information age and the entertainment and the obsessive nature with which people treat it, doesn't reward people who apologize or who admit defeat in that sort of way. So they're just operating in that world as well by refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing on their part. But that all gets me to think about, like you said, how should Christians respond? What do Christians do? And I don't think the answer is with something like social media, for example, or media in general, or news reporting. The answer can't be that Christians just leave, right? That we just withdraw. The answer is in part to engage, especially if that's where all of our neighbors are right now, to engage. But we have to engage differently. And unfortunately, too many times we engage the same way and then just say, well, we're doing it as Christians. But like Christian news outlets or Christian people in news outlets should not be the ones who are running with stories before having all the information, or who refuse to admit when they've made a mistake. And part of that is just being a Christian and being a Christ follower, but also part of that is maintaining a credibility that is needed for any sort of social stability later on. Because I don't know where to go now. It's not like I have the internet and now I know that it's a cesspool at this point, and I can look at this lab coronavirus example and just know, well, I'll go read newspapers over here. There's nowhere to go, and that feels really scary. It feels out of control.
Yeah, I think your point needs to be highlighted, that we have to do this differently. We have to do this better. In other words, Christians in an age of information are not just tasked with advancing what is true. We're tasked in advancing what is true in good ways.
Yeah.
And that means we've got to learn different skills. That's why we went back and did so much in the Proverbs at the beginning of the year. I just kind of stunned by that reality that a soft answer turns away wrath is not just kind of, maybe that'll help me get my point across, but it's actually something we should do because we're made in the image of God, and every person we've met is made in the image of God. It kind of goes back to the very beginning of our episode here, where I was talking about walking away from this weekend just convinced that we're going to have to figure out what it means to love our enemies. And I don't know what that looks like going forward, but it's going to be harder than we think it is. And let me also say this. In light of the last year, and by the way, I really wanted to talk about this topic because my friend Dan Darling over at NRB tweeted something that I thought was really important. He said, if you're concerned as I am about conspiracy theories, you have to look at the way much media has so often gotten things wrong. And he lists 4 things: the lab leak theory, which we were just talking about, Andrew Cuomo versus Governor DeSantis, Governor Cuomo versus Governor DeSantis, the vaccine by April, and Texas reopening. And those are just 4 things. We could list more. And he said, trust in conspiracies rise when trust in institutions is low. I think he is exactly right. Mm-hmm. I also want to point out something also that the world, listening to Rebecca McLaughlin over the Wilberforce weekend, is the ability to kind of face the cold, hard facts when it comes to our place or what in culture, or what culture actually thinks when it comes to the issues we care about, or so on. And that is, this is the reality. Like, this is not something then that unravels itself just by doing the next thing right. This is a long slog through learning how to wrestle with ideas in a Christian way, learning to think Christianly and apply it to the cultural issues of our day. People are lost. If you take this segment on the podcast, add it to the last segment on the podcast, and then say, what is the church's calling in this cultural moment? Choosing to, quote unquote, sit this one out, whether it is dealing with misinformation, dealing with the attack on unborn human life, dealing with the issues of conscience rights and religious freedom, that means the church is literally making itself irrelevant. It has decided, because this is the place where people are in the slog of the confusion of the information age. And there's no other institution. There's no other reality Chuck would be really mad that I just called the church an institution, but there's no other institution or organism in the world equipped to handle this confusion.
Yeah.
And churches that choose not to jump in on these things are churches that are making themselves irrelevant to where people are day in and day out in their lives. This is more than just a story about the lab leak and whether the virus originated here or there. This is a larger point to something that we've been looking at for years, and that is, how does the world change in an information age? And how does a Christian worldview speak to those larger concerns and larger questions? And this is this is just the most obvious, at least in my lifetime so far, of where this leads. I think there's and the more we talk here, Maria, the more I'm convinced that maybe this segment and the last segment about the growing angst among people should be added together. Yeah. Because what if you grew up believing that everything you heard you had to be skeptical or cynical of?
Yeah,
that there was no one you could actually look at and go, they'll tell me the truth.
Yeah. Well, then,
and they'll tell me the truth about the hard things.
There's so many
just feel
implications of that, because we could go so many directions, because one of the things that strikes me about it is you would feel so unsettled, like in a literal way.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're not even sure, you don't know if anything's true. But then once somebody offered you a sense of control, like if you wear a mask, you can control what happens to you. Or if you do this, if you say you're a man when you're a woman, you can control what you are. Wouldn't you grasp at that as if it were an absolute lifeline? Because you're living in a world where nothing feels in your control, but then someone promises you could have it. You would take it wherever you can get it,
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think of,
that's right.
It makes me think, so I'm going to bring up Paralandra again, because I'm seeing it everywhere. This is the C.S. Lewis book I'm reading, but at the end.
Well, this counts as your recommendation for the
okay,
record.
Fair enough.
You're
fair
recommending
enough.
Paralandra.
Yeah.
I don't care if you had anything else in mind, but that's what you're recommending.
Yeah, I'm absolutely recommending it. At one point, they're talking about, I'm going to try and figure out how to say this without ruining anything, but this person is saying the fact that the world fell, right? That Eve gave in to the temptation and ate the apple. The world actually knows less about evil than it would have if she had not done that, right? So she did that under the promise that she would learn more about evil if she did it. But all it did was confuse us. We don't even know how to call evil what it is anymore. And the internet, like the way you were describing the information age, made me think of that, where it feels like we can know everything, but I actually think we know less than when we started. And it reminds me again of that commentary you and I did a while ago about, astronauts and NASA and astrophysicists have found in some areas light in deep space, and they don't know the origin of it, and they can't figure it out. And they're trying to use all of their systems to discover where it's coming from, as opposed to also entertaining the possibility that it's just there because a creator put it there. And I don't know, it might be there in a discoverable way through scientific method and all that kind of that stuff. But we just overthink things when we think we have all of the information. And I just thought that was a beautiful analogy in the book, that, you can think more and you actually know less.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot talks about this in Courses from the Rock. Where is the life we've lost in living? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? Where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? And in an age of information, those things are put on a straight line: wisdom, knowledge, and information, and there's an equal sign between all of them. And that is just not true. You can know more about stuff and know less about how to live. This is what happens. We talked a little bit about this past weekend at Wilberforce, that when you meet someone, I was talking about Chuck Colson, and how one of the remarkable things about Chuck is he was fully alive. When you think about Chuck, there's people that you think are uber spiritual, and then you think about people who uber full of life. And that was Matt Hurd's message right before Kathy
Yeah.
Cook's message. And together, that was a real powerhouse because and then following with Jennifer Marshall Patterson's talk on wisdom as being fully and truly human. That's what made that such a punch, is that Proverbs is telling us how to be truly human. And recognizing our humanity as a created goodness that has been affected by the fall and infected and afflicted by the fall, but still designed in its creation as good. And then Matt talking about Christ coming to give us life with a capital L. It's just, you just put all that together, and you just think about all the ways that when you draw a line between information, knowledge, and wisdom, as if those are the same things, you're just misunderstanding. You're just not reading the room, and by the room I mean life. You're just missing what it all is.
And everything the world tells you will make you more human or will give you full life. That's not just life a different way. That's not a different way to be human. That's a way to be less human. That really was driven home by those speakers you were talking about.